Our sermon on first series on 1 Peter, I want to just keep reminding us of this. I hope you'll have this memorized. The long version of what 1 Peter is about is you are different, so be different so that you can make a difference in the world. And the whole book is organized around that progression. More simply, we've been talking about being positively odd, being a little bit different, having a different identity, not quite fitting in, but in a positive way so that it actually makes a good difference. However, today's sermon is going to be potentially just weirdly odd, because we're coming to a text in 1 Peter that is really, really strange, for some people, and it's really kind of created a lot of disagreement. Martin Luther, who generally was more sure of himself than he ought to have been, generally didn't have a lot of questions and doubts, but even Martin Luther said he wasn't sure what this text means. And if you look at all the different, interpretation possibilities in the text we're going to look at, someone calculated, that there's about 140 different ways of putting all this together and figuring out what it is that Peter is talking about. And I, would have been tempted to maybe just skip it, we'll just kind of ignore this kind of hard passage, move on to the next passage. That seemed like cheating. So I felt like, especially if you're reading through 1 Peter and you've read some of these words and wondered, what in the world is Peter talking about? Let me assure you, thousands of people, have wondered, what in the world is people talking about? And New Testament scholars have looked at these verses and asked, what in the world is Peter talking about? So I want to talk about it a little bit, try to make it clear to you at least how I understand this, but even if some of this is like, I don't really care, Mark, I think at the end, we can get how this applies to us. So there's a message to us, even if some part of my steps to try to get there, if you even need to tune me out or just go get coffee, get your coffee. I want to talk through what's going on in this particular text, even if it's a little bit of a weirdly odd text. So this is the end of 1 Peter chapter 3. Peter says it's better if God should will it so that you suffer for doing what is right rather than for doing what is wrong. I hope now, if you've been in this series, you're aware that Peter is writing this because this church is beginning to suffer some persecution, not yet kind of official government persecution, but the pressure is on in society. Okay, and that's going to create a lot of temptations for these little communities, in the midst of the Roman Empire. And so Peter is encouraging them why they need to hold on. In fact, that will be the key to understanding what Peter is going to do in this text. But as always, then, Peter turns to the example of Christ and how Jesus is the answer to, everything. Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God. He was put to death in the flesh, but he was made alive in the Spirit, in which he also went and made proclamation to spirits in prison, who once were disobedient when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal or pledge to God for a good conscience or from a good conscience, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who is at the right hand of God, having gone into heaven after angels and authorities and powers have been subjected to him. Just want to draw your attention to the last verse because that's going to be part of the key to what's going on here. You might think that last verse is almost just kind of Peter tacks it on to the end of this thing because he wants to say something spiritual or uplifting or whatever. But that's really, this whole text is driving to that point, to verse 22. It's all moving to that. And it's all pointed to that, and that actually explains why Peter is going to say what he's going to say here. Jesus is at the right hand of God, and he ascended into heaven, after angels and authorities and powers have been subjected to him. Now, one of the things that's hard about a text like this is that it wasn't first written to us. I know that can be shocking, but Peter was first writing to those little churches in Asia and Bithynia, Cappadocia, to those little churches. And they had their own context and their own understanding. And Peter's developing an argument that actually is going to make a lot of sense to them. For us, it takes us a little bit more work to figure out why he says what he's going to say. And you might not even appreciate his argument, and that's okay because you aren't those people. Okay, but I think you can appreciate what Peter is doing and why he's going to do it, and there is a message for us, even if he was first writing for them in their context based on their understanding. Okay, and so he brings up Noah, and you might think, why in the world, where does Noah come? You know, of all the possible characters in the Old Testament, why in the world does Peter use Noah, to make the point that he wants to make? And there's a couple reasons, and his reference to Noah is going to help him to make two central points that he wants to make. But one of the reasons he chooses Noah is because Noah was a well-known character, especially in this area, not just among Jewish people or Christian people. Okay, because there was already stories about Noah in the flood, this particular area of what is now Turkey. Noah's image was put onto coins. Okay, and so even these, Christians who didn't go to the synagogue or anything, they knew who Noah was. Okay, so they knew some of these stories, and so that's why Peter latches on Noah, because it was simply a character that they were already thinking about in their own context. Okay, so it's really a brilliant move on the part of Peter to choose Noah. Okay, and there's a couple parts of the Noah story that's going to help him to be able to say what he wants to say to these people. Now, part of the problem in this text is when it talks about Jesus was put to death in the flesh, and what does that exactly mean? And made alive in the spirit, what exactly does that mean? And then he went and made this proclamation to these spirits in prison. And so there's all sorts of different understandings about what's going on here. And one of the popular theories in church history was this is talking about after Jesus was crucified, but before he was raised from the dead, he went down to the realm of the dead, those are the spirits in prison, and he preached to them. And maybe what he preached to them is maybe even after they were dead, he was giving them a chance to repent, and to ultimately go to heaven. I mean, that's one of the more common explanations of this text. Okay? But in any case, important questions are, when did Jesus do this? When did he do this preaching or proclamation? And to whom did he proclaim it? Who are the spirits in prison? And what did he proclaim? What was this message? Was it a message of salvation? Was it a message of judgment? What is it? Okay, and so these are the questions that for literally hundreds of years, scholars have written, big books. Just this last week, I read an entire book that was just on basically these verses, and it was probably a short book in comparison to some. But these are the questions. But there's a couple keys to figuring out why Peter talks about these things and what the answer, at least, again, I'm going to present what I think is the best answer to this question. Okay, other people might well disagree. I think the majority of scholars have the same opinion that I do. I basically got it from them. I didn't figure everything out myself, incidentally. So what I'm going to present to you is not a bizarre theory, but again, it makes sense to the original audience. And like I already said, one of the keys to figuring this out is the context of this text in 1 Peter. Why is Peter writing this? He's writing to persecuted people, who are being tempted possibly to walk away from the faith, and he's trying to give them reasons to hang on. Okay? And so whatever this means, it's got to apply to them. The other thing that is helpful is to know what the kinds of stories about Noah that were being written and told at that time. Okay, because there are other pieces of ancient literature that talked about Noah and who these are, and all these different parts of the story come together in these other stories, okay, that the original audience knew. Okay, so again, this is, we've got a bridge 2,000 years of history in very different contexts and very different languages, but the original audience got this because they knew these stories. And basically the story is this: in the time of Noah, and you can see hints of this in the book of Genesis, that these spirits are not human spirits. They are spiritual, supernatural powers. Basically, angels who have rebelled against God. And in the New Testament, generally when it just says spirits, the spirits, it's referring to these wicked spirits, disobedient spirits, not human spirits, but supernatural spirits. And in those Noah stories, the evil that came at Noah's time came about because these supernatural beings, these spirits, disobeyed God and came to earth and intermingled with humans, and they created this wicked offspring. And that's why it was so evil in Noah's time. Okay, so these spirits are not human spirits. They are spiritual powers, supernatural powers. They are greater than human spirits. Okay, who brought that evil at Noah's time. Okay, those are these spirits that are in prison. Where the prison is, probably Peter doesn't have some particular place in mind. He's simply saying they were bounded. They are no longer completely free. They are under control of God. Okay, they are only limited to the space that God has allowed them to have at this point in time. Okay, they're no longer free to do whatever it is they want to do. So I think those are what these spirits are. When did Jesus do this? In the progression of this text, he was put to death in the flesh and then made alive in the spirit, which almost certainly refers to the resurrection. Okay, so this almost certainly has to have happened after the resurrection. It's not a story of Jesus dies, goes down to the place of the dead, and preaches something, then is raised from the dead. This is after that. Okay, and in these original stories, the ascension of Jesus, it's a story of Jesus rising through the heavens. And that's where these spirits are in prison, not in heaven like the abode of God, but they're kind of somewhere not on this earth. And so the story is Jesus ascends to heaven. If you remember the end of that text, that's what Peter talks about. He ascends to the right hand of God. And so in his ascension, crucifixion and resurrection and ascending, what he is proclaiming to these evil spirits is, you lose. You have lost. You're losers. Jesus is proclaiming his own victory. And that's the proclamation that Jesus gives. That's the message. I'm the victor. And you rebelled against God the Father. And you brought all this evil, but you lost. You lost. You're a loser. I'm the victor. That's the message. That's the proclamation. And it might not even be so much what Jesus said in words, but in the resurrection and the ascension, that was the declaration that they lost. That was surprise. They thought they killed the Son of God, and they lost. Caesar lost. Pontius Pilate lost. Religious leaders lost. They all lost. They thought they won. And in killing Jesus, at that moment they lost. And when he rose from the dead, they knew they lost, and the spiritual powers knew they are losers. Okay, that's the message. See, and this is how it applies to these little group of Christians who are struggling under the powers, their neighbors, and the other maybe city officials who are looking on them. And they have power over this little group of Christians, and they're just thinking, are we going to make it? The Roman Empire, how great it is. What can we do against the Roman Empire? How can we win against Caesar? Caesar always wins. Caesar has been winning for centuries. And what they hear from Peter is a message: Caesar's never going to win. Not only is Jesus defeated Caesar, he's defeated the powers above Caesar, the supernatural powers behind the entire Roman Empire. It's lost already. It's lost already. Your enemies have already lost. They've already lost. And Jesus has already proclaimed his victory. So that's one of the reasons Peter uses the Noah story, because in their culture, in their context, the Noah story brought in these supernatural powers that are defeated. Okay? So that's part of what's going on in this text. So it's better, if God should will it so, for you to suffer for doing what is right rather than doing what is wrong. Because remember the story of Christ. He died for your sin. That's been taken care of. Don't got to worry about that anymore. He was put to death in the flesh, but he was made alive in the spirit. And look what he did. He proclaimed his victory. These supernatural powers, they were disobedient. And during those days, and how hard those days were for Noah, how long did it take him to build that ark? I mean, it was 8 people building that ark. Maybe Noah had money and hired some other people, but man, can you imagine building a big boat back then, how long that took? Can you imagine what people thought looking at that boat? Not positively odd. I mean, Noah was weirdly odd. And how he must have felt for year after year. God waited patiently. The powers thought they had won. The disobedient spirits thought they had won. But as a matter of fact, 8 persons were brought safely through the water. And corresponding to that, baptism now saves you. Not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but the pledge to God out of a good conscience. And it saves you through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He's at the right hand of God, and he's gone into heaven. Again, I think this is his proclamation of victory. He's gone into heaven. Angels and authorities and powers, those are the spirits. They've been subjected to him. So the other thing that Peter wants to say through the Noah story is something about their own salvation. And again, he's going to use the Noah story, and it's kind of a symbol or analogy for something that God does for them. And that kind of brings up another a little bit hard text about the place of baptism. Okay, because he says, corresponding to that Noah story, baptism now saves you. Okay, and so there's often a question, what is the meaning of baptism? Do we have to be baptized? If you just get wet in church, does that mean you're saved? Is that what baptism is? And so those are questions about what does baptism mean. And Peter wants to remove any misunderstanding about what baptism does, what its role in our salvation. So first he says, okay, baptism is not the removal of dirt from the flesh. At Anita's baptism, I talked about this passage recently. It was pretty cold then. Probably no one was listening to anything I was saying, because we were all standing there and, waiting to get even colder. But as I said then, Peter isn't talking about physical washing. He's not saying something, so plain that, baptism it's not about physical dirt being washed off your physical body. He's not saying that, of course, but he's also, what he's trying to communicate is that basically that it's not a magical thing. Just getting wet doesn't automatically remove your sin. Okay, that's not exactly what baptism is. Okay, he's talked about dealing with our sin in other places in 1 Peter. So the first thing he wants to say, that's, it's not an automatic or kind of magical thing. You don't get baptized because then it's like, wow, I got wet in church, and now I can go back to my life and everything is okay, because I had this magical getting wet in church where I can shoot to heaven when I die. It's not That's not the sense in which baptism saves us. But the other way Peter communicates that is through this analogy with Noah. So he says in the days of Noah, a few were saved through the water. Okay, so there, the water, which was also water of judgment, is what actually floated the boat. So the water, in that sense, in Noah's case, saved them. It lifted them in the boat, and well, yeah, you're right, but that doesn't fit what Peter's trying to do 2,000 years ago. That's how we need to read why Peter says what he says there. Okay, yes, the boat saved them and God saved them, but in this analogy, he wants to focus on the water, okay, because he wants to remind them of their baptism for reasons that will become clear eventually. So he focuses not on the boat, he focuses on the water that saves them. For us, for these readers, he says, you Christians there in Asia, Bithynia, Cappadocia, baptism saves you, again, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but baptism saves you through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Okay? So it's Jesus who saves. It's not the water that saves. Okay, so you can see in that analogy now Peter is going past the water. It's not mainly about the water. He's just connecting a couple dots to get some ideas in their mind, to get them thinking about their own salvation, but their own salvation isn't based on baptism. Their salvation is based on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So this is the second reason Peter uses the Noah story. Okay, it allows him to talk about water and use the water to talk about their salvation. Again, the water and the baptism is almost incidental. It's for them, for the early church, if you were a Christian, you got baptized, usually very quickly after your conversion. In churches now, a lot of times they make you wait a long time and you go through these long courses and that kind of thing. But in the early church, most of the time when you confessed your faith in Jesus, someone was looking for water to baptize you. And so that's why baptism was just part of that original process. It was a symbol for the whole thing of their salvation. Okay, and so Peter uses the water of baptism just a way for them to think about what they had done when they made their pledge to Jesus. Again, remember how this starts. It's better if God should will it so that you suffer for doing what is right rather than doing what is wrong. Because Christ also died for sins once for all. Again, this is why Peter is saying all of this. Okay, this is his practical purpose. You're under pressure, you're under stress, you're under persecution. That's creating temptation, all sorts of temptation. Hold on to Jesus. Keep doing right. Keep being positively odd. Keep being positively odd. It will put you at odds with your context and with your culture, but keep being positively odd. Okay. What you pledged when you were baptized, when you committed your life to Christ, when you made this pledge, and I for the sake of time, I won't talk about the word pledge. It's another one of those words that can be, understood different ways. But basically, it's a question and answer where, in response to the question of their faith in Jesus, they declared, "Yes, my faith is in Jesus," and they made that pledge that they were followers of Jesus. And be easy, very easy to turn away from their pledge. And Peter is simply saying, don't do it. Don't worry about the powers of your context. They are defeated powers. And even now, Jesus is declaring his victory over them. They're defeated. Hold on to your pledge. Hold on to Jesus. Again, this is why Peter is writing this. It's an argument that might not touch us, but it certainly would have affected them. They would have understood what Peter was trying to tell them. why they needed to hold on to Jesus and live Jesus' life and follow Jesus with their life. So that's how it applied to them. What does this have to do with us? The discussion about who the spirits were trying to help us to think through what it was that Peter was trying to communicate. But I think even if we have some questions about that, or if that just seems like a little bit of a weird argument, I think we can understand what Peter says that we can hold on to this morning. One of the things that becomes clear in this text is our role in conversion and then God's role in that whole process. So here, the way Peter puts it, and he put it in different terms in other places in this letter, it's a pledge you make from a good conscience. From real belief from the heart, and you make this pledge, this promise about holding on to Jesus and following Jesus and who your Lord is. Okay, that's what people need to do. That's our role, you might say. That's our response. Our response is necessary. Okay, we have to respond. But on the other side, this is what God does. First, sending His Son. Christ died for sins. Okay, there was that sin problem that we couldn't fix. We couldn't fix that because we had the problem. We couldn't fix our own sin problem. Well, God took care of that, and He sent His Son who died for sins, and He was put to death in the flesh, but He was made alive in the Spirit. But not only that, there's the resurrection from the dead. This is the second thing that God does for our salvation. It's not just that He died for our sins and that's that, but He rose again and He's alive now and He's active now. But He's now at the right hand of God, exerting or showing His victory over all the enemies. And so, you can just see how much more that God provided than what we provide. And even our part, we couldn't even do that without God. Even to do our part, we needed God to do something. There's no room for boasting. Yeah, we have to make a choice. We have to have faith. The faith is ours. We have to make this pledge. So we do have a place in the story. Our choice is important, but even our choice can happen only because of what God has done, only because He moved first. We love because He first loved us. We have faith because He first came and spoke His word to us. And our choice only has meaning because of this amazing thing that God has done for our salvation. So we have a role, we have a part to play. Okay? But it should be quite obvious that God's part is the majority of that, what happens in our salvation. But really, this is where I'm driving with this message, and why I think it's important to us, or it might be important to us, maybe especially important to some of you. I don't know what your current temptations are. This is our role. In becoming followers of Jesus, this is kind of the little role that we played then, maybe symbolized by our baptism. But there's an ongoing importance of our role. There's a reason that you might not have thought of why it's important for you to be faithful. Why what you do matters. Why it's important for us to pay attention even to what Peter says in this little letter, and we think about the lifestyle he's encouraged us toward in our relationships with government and with our bosses and in our homes and with our neighbors. There's an importance to all of that. There's an importance to every interaction that we have. I don't know if you remember at the beginning of this series, not at the beginning, but several weeks ago, Nenad was talking about this text from chapter 2. It's really one of the key texts. I kind of felt bad that I let Nenad preach on this text because I kind of really wanted to preach on this. But anyway, Nenad did a good job and he made a couple good points. But this is one of the key texts in 1 Peter, where he's going to talk about you are different, so be different. You're a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, once you were nobodies, once you were nothing. But now you're God's people. You are God's people. Once you hadn't received mercy, but now you have received mercy. And we are that so that we can proclaim the excellencies of him who called us out of darkness into his light. And in the context of 1 Peter, that proclaiming those excellencies are not mainly what we do with our mouths. Because right after this, what Peter begins to talk about is how we live. I mean, if you recall when we looked at that other very hard text about husbands and wives, and you know, Peter says to the wives, you know, maybe without words, you know, you can win your husband. Without words, the wives will still proclaim. You can speak without speaking. Of course, if you have a chance to speak words, people need true words. So be ready to speak. You know, that was in the text last week. You know, always be ready to give an answer, to give an explanation, a defense of your faith. If you're called upon to speak, be ready to speak. If God gives you an opportunity to speak, then speak. And if you love Jesus, you're going to talk about Jesus when you get a chance, but you can speak without speaking. Your life is a proclamation. What I had said then, and it's really one of the kind of brilliant lines, is that God's architecture is biological. And in the context of chapter 2, Peter talks about you're being built as a temple, and you are living stones. You're living stones. A temple communicates. You see any kind of temple, it communicates something. This building communicates. Those pictures are a communication. Buildings communicate, especially temples communicate just by their presence, by what they look like, by their design and the materials. They all communicate. And Peter has told them, you're a living temple. And you speak just by being who you are supposed to be. God's architecture is biological. It's no longer a physical temple. God is no longer concerned about a building communicating. You are that now. You are that communication. Forget about buildings. You are that temple that proclaims a message. And so God's communication is biological. The way that God speaks now is in living bodies, flesh and blood that people see. You might be sitting in class and the lecturer is talking on and on. It might be interesting, it might be boring or whatever, but you're silent. You're listening to the lecture. I hope you're silent. I hope you're not writing notes or whatever or looking on your phone. Be a good student. But you're silent, sitting there at your desk, but you're speaking. You're speaking. And you're surrounded by people who are seeing the temple. God's communication is biological. Peter was developing this image of Jesus proclaiming something to these spirits in prison. And I suggested that proclamation might not mainly have been words, that Jesus went to them and said to them, but it was in the very act of resurrection and ascending to heaven. That was the proclamation. And these spirits see that and they get the message. Oh, we made the wrong choice. He's the victor. And that's a message that is going on. They're still getting that message. Jesus is still proclaiming His victory. These spirits in prison are still hearing that message and seeing that message. I would suggest that for 2,000 years, this message has been communicated. Here's how it's been communicated. See, you guys thought you were just getting wet. You were proclaiming a message. And not just the people who got baptized, all the others standing there. You were part of Jesus' proclamation. You didn't know it. I don't think I even thought about it then. I didn't really, processing this passage this week, it just renewed in my mind the importance of these things that we do. There might not have been a lot of extra human beings who were watching these baptisms. But there were hundreds, maybe thousands, of spirits who were watching that. And Jesus proclaimed His victory through you. You are that ongoing proclamation that Jesus is the winner. That's how important you are now in God's plan. It's why it's so important to hold on to Jesus, and it's so important how you live in this world. It's not even just about this world. It's about all of creation and all the evil spirits, and you are the proclamation of the victory of Jesus. And if you just think about it very concretely, it really is true. God has been proclaiming His victory. God has won in Latvia. He's already won, and here some of you Latvians are here. And Satan's desire for people in Latvia, he lost. He wanted them all to go to hell, and he lost. And here you are. Same way with Lithuania. God is victor in India, and here you are. And in Sri Lanka, God won there. And in America, God wins. He's victor there. As hard as it might be to believe it, He's victor. And in Germany, God won, and right here you're proclaiming the victory of God. The evil powers didn't want you here, and here you are. Jesus won. And Norway, New Zealand, or South Africa, and Vietnam, is Jesus victor in Vietnam? Yes, He is. Yes, He is. And He's been victor in Vietnam for 2,000 years, and He's victor in Russia. And He's victor in Czech Republic, and He's victor in Moldova. I shouldn't mention Croatia since Nenad isn't here, but He's victor in Croatia. He's victor, and you are the proclamation, and this is the ongoing proclamation of the victory of Jesus. And this is why you need to hold on, to keep proclaiming that. and why you need to continue to be different, because in your being different, Jesus is proclaiming his victory. This is what you get to do. You get to have this role. You are God's proclamation. You are God's diaspora. Do you remember that word from a couple sermons back? The seed of the word, and you are the diaspora. That God has sent, God has chosen you in your place. You are the diaspora in RSU and RTU and LU. Okay, you're God's proclamation of victory there. You are, not me. I'm not there. You're that. You've got to be that there. You're the diaspora in the embassy. You're the diaspora in banks. You're the diaspora in your school. You're the diaspora at the, railway department. You're God's proclamation of victory. That's what you're there for. That's your role. That's why you have to hold on to Jesus. You proclaim his victory. You are the proclamation. You are the proclamation. In you, Jesus is proclaiming his victory. What you do is important, and how you live is important. Your entire life is that proclamation. Through you, Jesus wants to say, I am victor. And the enemies are going to lose. They're going to lose. Maybe not all of them know it yet. And if Jesus could defeat these great spiritual powers, any of the enemies facing you are in his hands. Just hold on to Jesus. That's the message that Peter is trying to communicate to this little frightened body of baptized believers who are very tempted to walk away. Hold on to Jesus. Maintain your lifestyle. Don't give in to the pressure. You think you're no one. You're the proclamation of Jesus. You think you have no influence. You're the proclamation of Jesus. You think no one is really watching. More are watching us right now than we are aware of. And right now, we're the proclamation. Right now, this group of people in these walls, in this strange kind of building that wasn't built for us. Again, as Nenad said, this was another kind of temple. Okay? Someone built this temple for some other purposes, and they lost. And here we are. Our bodies are a declaration of the victory of Jesus. So hold on to Jesus. Father, I pray that we would take hope, and that we would have hope, and that our eyes would not primarily be on our circumstances or the culture around us, but our eyes would mainly be on you, that we would remember our pledge, that we would remember the crucifixion of our Lord Jesus, that we would remember that he is alive, that we would remember that he is even now working to establish his reign over all. That we fix our eyes on that, I pray. Amen. So, we're not done yet, but as Becky said, this is an important, time for Latvia, with the celebration of independence. So we generally on this day, at least once a year, want to remember our context. And so we want to spend a few minutes praying for Latvia. And then after we do that, the band is going to come up and, in honor of Latvia And to bless Latvia, we're going to sing a song in Latvian. So, those of you who are Latvian are going to really need to help us with that song. But in any case, I want us to spend a few minutes praying for Latvia, and I want to ask that maybe a few of you out there would lift your voices and lead us out loud in praying for Latvia. We should certainly have a prayer of thanks for Latvia and the people here. Compared to a lot of places in the world, this is a pretty good place to live. If you like coffee, this is a great place to live. Lots of good coffee, lots of good restaurants. We should thank God for Latvia that we could be here. It's a gift. We should pray for the church in Latvia that it will be salt and light. And if you know some other Latvian church leaders, you can even lift their name and help us to pray for them. We should pray for the government, that there will be wise and just decisions. And then in prayer for the people living in Latvia, which includes you, whether you're Latvian or not. So you can pray for yourself here in this land, but also pray for Latvians. So let's just spend a few minutes, and like I said, it would be great if a few of you would be willing to raise your voice and lead us in praying for some of these things, but certainly where you are sitting, you can at least pray silently that God would bless Latvia.